They come from all walks of life. Computer experts, artists, engineers, booksellers, and blue-collar workers. They all have one thing in common: a fascination for the paranormal. At times passionate to the point of being obsessed, they are known as UFO hunters. For the past 50 years, the phenomenon of unidentified flying objects, commonly referred to as UFOs, has frequently made the headlines. Exploited by tabloids, ridiculed by skeptics, and for the most part scorned by the scientific community, the UFO phenomenon has captured popular imagination. In Canada, surveys confirm that the public is interested in unidentified flying objects. In the United States, dozens of books on the subject are published each year, and Hollywood generally comes out with at least one film per season. The U.S. has the largest UFO group in the world, called MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. Its members gather every year at the International UFO Symposium. Webmaster for the internet site UFOcity.com and co-author of Left at Eastgate, Peter Robbins is a well-known New York artist. He is quite familiar with the community of UFO hunters.
We are a wildly varying lot of people. We are as different as any random section of society, I think. What unites us is an intellectual curiosity, maybe a little bit of a spirit of adventure. Most of us like digging either allegorically or in a library or actually in the field. Most of us are somewhat idealistic, which usually means we're somewhat naive.
They are obviously motivated by a desire to try and understand what's happening. Often, when you scratch beneath the surface, you find a desire to believe in the existence of extraterrestrials. Behind their impartial front, we can see their desire to believe.
We actually are interested in the truth about something that is a genuine mystery. Some of us have PhDs in the natural sciences. Many of us have backgrounds in the arts, and we come to it from a creative sensibility.
It is precisely this eclectic attitude that has greatly contributed to tarnishing the reputation of the UFO community. As soon as a UFO is observed, UFO hunters find themselves shoulder to shoulder with journalists at the site where it was observed, both trying to make the most out of it. One camp sees it as a great news story, while the other camp sees an opportunity to talk about their wild theories. Worldwide cover-ups, alien abductions, or a threat of an alien invasion. Comments made by serious researchers often become buried in the tall tales which attract the media. Caught up in this three-ring circus of ideology, it is not surprising that over the years, UFO hunters have gained the reputation of attracting crackpots.
Like many fields of research or natural interest, we as a group have grown somewhat more sophisticated over the years. We have seen more frauds. We have seen more genuine, remarkably important breakthroughs in research. We are a bit better organized. We are maybe a little bit more respected by the general population, but not so much.
Over the years, UFO groups have been forced to evolve according to the interests of their members. Their interest is often tempered by the events themselves and by pressure from the media. UFOs are not the same today as they were years ago. To better understand this evolution, we have to go back to the Kenneth Arnold affair in 1947, which spawned the expression flying saucer. No one is better qualified to lead us back in time than French sociologist Pierre Lagrange, a research scientist with the Center for Sociology of Innovation in Paris. Pierre has written several reports on UFO studies, and over the past few years, he has gained recognition as one of the world's leading authorities in the field of UFO history.
The Kenneth Arnold affair marked the beginning of flying saucers. That was when the expression flying saucer was first invented. His story happened on June 24, 1947. He was a 32-year-old private pilot and businessman who saw strange discs flying over Mount Rainier, Washington, in the American Northwest. According to Arnold, they were flying twice as fast as the speed of sound, and they had an unusual shape. They were not exactly saucer-shaped. They were rounded in the front and triangular in the back.
And he described their flight as saucers skimming over the water. And when he reported this to a reporter, a news reporter, the journalist wrote down flying saucers, and the name was born and has been with us ever since.
The objects seen by Kenneth Arnold were probably nothing more than a flock of migrating birds. However, his story gave birth to the modern era of flying saucers. Back in 1947, unidentified flying objects were not synonymous with extraterrestrial spacecraft.
At the time back in 1947, Kenneth Arnold thought he was seeing secret weapons. Obviously, the prospect of extraterrestrials was soon raised. If we look back at the first articles written in the press on June 26 and 27, 1947, the objects were not only presented as extraterrestrial airships. That was just one theory among others. The theory of secret aircraft was the most popular.
The day after Kenneth Arnold's observation, the U.S. Army put up a wall of silence and took extraordinary defense measures.
Planes are on patrol for flying saucers. Cameras installed to photograph them. Portland, Oregon, the area from which came the first weird reports.
However, despite all of the military's preparations, an entire fleet of flying saucers seemed to be descending upon the United States. Throughout the country, Americans were claiming to have seen unidentified flying objects.
A lot of people these days, they're seeing flying saucers everywhere. Flocks of fantastic discs flying through the air.
Since the Army was refusing to release these reports to the public, small groups of 2 or 3 people each began collecting information on these sightings.
To be looking for the mysterious disc.
It was the dawn of ufology, the study of UFOs.
There's a flying saucer with milk.
The first ufologists appeared in the 1950s in groups such as NECAP and APRO, which integrated a large mass of scattered information. At first, UFOs were only seen flying in the sky. They hovered and flew away but didn't land. Then gradually stories began pouring in about landings. Investigators changed their view over time.
History professor at Temple University in Philadelphia, David Jacobs is the author of the famous UFO controversy in America.
Well, I think that the role of some of the early UFO organizations like APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, and NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, in the overall controversy over UFOs was really very, very important. I think that these are groups that continue to collect reports, they analyzed reports, they kept the subject in front of the public, and helped to also pioneer methodology for how you can do this, how you can actually investigate reports.
It was in this fervor of the 1950s that people began speculating that these unidentified flying objects were of alien origin. These speculations soon became the most popular way of interpreting these objects. Left in the dark, the more conservative researchers who refused to share this opinion without an argument were stigmatized as ignorant or having little faith by those who supported the theory. Now, 50 years after that initial sighting by Kenneth Arnold, we can only wonder how UFOs, which were originally thought to be top-secret weapons, came to be thought of as interplanetary vehicles. How is it that extraterrestrials have become the focus of UFO study?
One of the first people to introduce the idea that flying saucers were of alien origin was Donald Keyhoe, a former member of the U.S. military who became a journalist, and while working for True magazine in 1949 was assigned to investigate the story. Keyhoe was rather skeptical at first, since most of the contacts he had kept in the Army told him there was nothing to the story. But as he dug deeper, he began to think that the military wasn't telling him everything they knew, that there may be something to the story after all. The article that he published in the January 1950 issue of True was one of the first to really popularize the alien theory.
3 years later, Donald Keyhoe wrote Flying Saucers from Outer Space, whose popularity at bookstores further entrenched the theory that UFOs were of alien origin. From there on, lines were drawn between those who believed in extraterrestrials and those who didn't. While America was debating over whether or not unidentified flying objects were alien in origin, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, France was experiencing an unprecedented wave of UFO sightings. Up until then, UFOs were just strange things flying around in the sky. But now they seem to be landing everywhere. Even worse, the occupants of these spaceships were strolling around on our planet. One of the most striking stories happened to Marius Deville from Carouble in northern France on September 10th, 1954.
I heard my dog barking, and it didn't sound normal to me. At first, I just ignored him, but then I decided to go see what he was barking about. I came over here, and I saw two men, or rather, two beings.
How far away were they?
They were on the other side of that road there, about 12, 15 feet away.
Can you tell us what they looked like?
They were pretty small. I'd say about 3 feet tall.
So your flying saucer was over there. How did it leave?
Well, it went straight up about 150 feet.
Straight up, like that?
Well, that's when it changed into a ball of fire and headed east.
In the 1960s, a whole new generation of investigators appeared on the scene, like John Keel, who wrote an entire series of books. He also investigated matters that did not seem to interest other people. He examined things that were outside of the box, things that seemed UFO-related, but which were still on the fringe. With investigators like John Keel, it wasn't just a matter of aliens visiting us in their flying saucers. Keel's perspective was much larger and more complex, touching on both ecology and the occult, with phenomena that might be linked to our basic human nature. Some people proposed psychological theories for his phenomena. Keel was now in the area of parapsychology, where things were happening to our society other than simple visits by extraterrestrials. Thanks to John Keel, a movement began in the late 70s that included both the UFOs and paranormal phenomena by people who took an interest in these things. They believed that the phenomena were closely linked to the witnesses.
The 1970s was also when the U.S. Air Force lost interest in UFOs. In parallel with the work being done by John Keel, other researchers joined the cause, often from university backgrounds, filling in the void left by the military.
In the 1970s in particular, after the Air Force in the United States stopped its Blue Book, Project Blue Book, what happened is that it was almost like people were finally free to come out in the open. Those who were brave could come out in the open, and they could now begin to talk about UFO research, do it openly, work together. That's why Alan Hynek formed the Center for UFO Studies in 1973. We had a scientific advisory board of fairly distinguished scientists. And this went on. There was a flowering of very serious UFO research in the 1970s. It had begun in the 1960s. It lasted some into the 1980s to a certain extent, but several factors intervened. Not Roswell, not necessarily abductions, other problems like lack of funding, again, like of the fact that no progress was being made.
lack of concrete results led some ufologists to question their beliefs, and they divided into two camps.
In the late 1970s, something interesting happened in ufology. Criticism began to come from within. Skeptics had been regarded as rationalists who knew nothing about the UFO cases. Now the situation began to change, and longtime believers who had felt strongly about the subject for years began to say, "We don't believe in them anymore." In 1977, French ufologist Michel Monnery wrote a book called What If UFOs Didn't Exist? According to the author, UFOs are nothing more than a misinterpretation of known phenomena. They're not real, they're only a myth. There are no aliens visiting us, and there are no strange phenomena. They were just mistakes made by confused people who saw Venus, weather balloons, aircraft, the moons, and other explainable phenomena.
UFO hunters were gradually becoming more aware that merely gathering witness accounts was not enough to fully understand the phenomenon.
What was happening in ufology in the 1970s when the first skeptics began to appear within their ranks? It was a time when, having discussed eyewitness accounts at length, UFO researchers began to think, we need to be more scientific. There's a price to pay. We have to change our methods. It's not enough just to gather eyewitness accounts. We need to produce evidence, like scientists do. For a long time, we thought that it was a scientist's job to observe nature. But in reality, a scientist's job is done in a laboratory. He very rarely sees nature. He spends his time looking at instruments, diagrams, and graphs. So his contact with nature is very remote. If he goes into the woods or on top of a mountain, he doesn't see anything. He's in the middle of nature and can't do anything. UFO researchers began to ask themselves, how can we present data relating to UFO stories so it'll be perceived as scientific? They realized that there was a price to pay, that they would need to do more than gather stories to succeed, or simply state their opinion like a judge or a police officer. They would need to delve into the facts and come up with items that would allow experts to decide if there was a case or not.
François Bourbeau belongs to this new generation of UFO researchers that appeared on the scene during this shift in ideology in the 1970s.
My first job, or my first goal, I should say, was to interest the university crowd in the study of UFOs. But I soon came up against a brick wall, from social prejudice to a wide variety of other prejudices. These men and women from universities were probably afraid of losing credibility among their peers. I would say that it also had to do with a lack of knowledge of the subject area. I must admit that in the field of UFO research, for serious amateurs like myself, who want to dig a little deeper to understand an issue, there is a fundamental lack of funding required to do the work. There's also a lack of human resources available. And to be perfectly honest, we also have very limited access to technology that would allow us to perform rapid tests on the spot, where physical evidence appears on the ground, for instance. With these tests, we could advance our own research, since we are on the front line, thereby eliminating a layer of analysis where we have to wait for the results before proceeding. We could also turn over our test results to experts for further research. Maybe that's where the problem lies.
A really good example of how this lack of funding and logistics can have an impact is the case of Saint-Marie-de-Manoir, a small rural town less than 60 miles from Montreal, Quebec.
At first I was sure that it was a 4x4, but when I got up and looked, I saw that it was over my neighbor's house.
It was blue everywhere in the house, and there was this persistent noise in the background.
I think it was something from outer space. I think they might be more advanced than us since they are coming to visit us.
It was bright everywhere. I'm not sure how far away it could be seen, but it was as bright as day where I was.
Several experts find this case to be particularly puzzling. UFO researchers involved in the case had to cut their investigation short, since they lacked the means to continue. François Bourbeau was one of the key figures in this affair.
The incident in Saint-Marie-de-Manoir was probably one of the best opportunities in scientific terms to pursue an in-depth study of the case. First of all, there were many witnesses, and several different types of witnesses at that, including highly competent ones, such as police officers.
I was amazed. I'd never seen anything like it before in my life.
Several levels of society were represented among the witnesses, and there was physical evidence left on the ground. Electromagnetic effects occurred in the immediate area, and a trace of the craft was left on the ground. This incident happened in winter, and the grass turned green where the UFO mark was found. Using my own money, I paid Laval University to analyze grass and soil samples. Chlorophyll levels were 10 times higher, and nitrogen had gone up by 300%.
I found it very bizarre, because the chlorophyll level should normally have been the same everywhere. I don't think it's humanly possible to fake chlorophyll levels in plants in November.
We had material on our hands that could have been genuinely investigated. But somehow we missed our big opportunity. We didn't succeed in capturing the interest of enough people in the fields of botany, physics, electricity, magnetics, or mathematics. We didn't get plant geneticists involved in our project. A lot of work could have been done to rule out natural causes.
Over the years, UFO hunters have gradually divided into two separate camps. One group represents the diehards, who still believe that UFOs are extraterrestrial in origin. The other group, mainly consisting of UFO researchers, define themselves as skeptics.
It appears that ufology is not the work of a single group of individuals, but rather a network of groups, like in the field of science. In my view, the fact that there are skeptics does not mean that ufology has become more scientific in approach. It means that researchers are starting to think like the people they used to criticize. Nowadays, skepticism about UFOs is a matter of personal opinion, just like believing in them used to be. It's not much different. After believing in UFOs for years, they decide not to believe anymore. What effect does that have? Rationalists say finally UFO researchers are becoming more scientific, but if we look at the facts, it just isn't true. Just when things were calming down and researchers were beginning to use a more scientific approach, the controversy started back up again. After having said they exist, they were turning around and saying they don't exist. Well, saying they don't exist doesn't make you a scientist, but it does spark controversy. This controversy is not making the field any more scientific. Since each person is proceeding according to their own personal opinion, it's very easy to become a UFO researcher. You have some business cards printed and publish an article in a few newsletters. It's much harder to be a scientist. You need to have diplomas, experience, and research work that's approved by others as a group.
The UFO field has been faced with two problems: frequent shifts in ideology and a lack of funding for its work. Victims of precarious budgets, most UFO associations cannot hire paid staff. This means that almost all of their members are volunteers, with the best of intentions, no doubt. But inevitably, they run into problems with the availability and competency of their members, which leads to less than ideal investigations. Fascinated by the subject of UFO since the mid-1970s, Antonio Junius, a writer for Fate magazine and co-author of the UFO Briefing document, is quite familiar with the problems faced by UFO researchers.
One of the main problems of ufological research is the lack of funds. This is very bad, and especially when you go even to other countries, it's even more acute. And there was a short period, I would say through the 90s, where you suddenly had this emergence of the philanthropists.
In the late 1990s, U.S. multimillionaire Lawrence Rockefeller financed a series of meetings on the American East Coast. Chaired by astrophysicist Peter Sturrock of Stanford University, California, The Pocantico meetings are now considered to be the most important initiative that has taken place in the field of UFO study over the past few years. Francois Louange is an optics specialist who directs Flex Image, a corporation specializing in satellite imagery. He was an active participant at the Pocantico meetings.
The Pocantico conference, organized by Mr. Rockefeller in 1997, was highly instructive. This gentleman, who has large sums of money, tends to spend a lot on artistic and human causes. Lawrence Rockefeller had a certain curiosity about UFOs in general, and crop circles in particular. So he financed this week-long meeting at his Pocantico Center where his family had once lived. The idea was to discuss physical evidence, not just for UFOs, but in general.
Basically, you had two types of scientists. You had ufological scientists. These were people who were professional scientists, like Vallée and even Velasco and Richard Haynes and John Schussler and many others, who made the case for ufology. And they presented, the best landing cases, the best photography and so on, the best radar cases. And then you had a panel of neutral scientists, and these were people who were neither in favor nor against it, but they were professional scientists.
The goal was to have researchers speak about UFOs in front of a group of scientists in the hopes of finding common ground and preparing a small booklet on their conclusions. Why did Rockefeller do this? Because up until that point, the only thing that existed in the field was the Condon report that had been sponsored by the U.S. Air Force several years earlier. The very thick Condon report was read by few people. It contains a lot of information, some of it on inexplicable phenomena. However, the official conclusions of the Condon report go something like this. First of all, we didn't find anything. And secondly, science has better things to do with its time than waste it on a subject like this that is of no interest. Condon closed the books on the subject, and scientists did that too. With regards to the Condon's conclusions, we agree at least on the first point. We didn't find anything really convincing, any absolute proof that unknown phenomena are occurring, and we found even less evidence of extraterrestrials. On the other hand, as to what science's position should be, we are diametrically opposed to Condon. We feel that given the evolution of the information gathered and the technologies at their disposal, it would be in the best interest of science to research the subject intelligently, to listen to UFO researchers, and to continue the work.
If the Pocantico conference led to a recognition of the interest in UFOs, then why does the science community at large seem so uninterested in this phenomenon?
If someone were to find a technological application for the UFO problem, then just watch the benefactors line up to finance it. Maybe not UFO groups at first, but if another meeting were held with Mr. Sturrock, there might be a group of people who would say, "Aha, we're being offered 10 million, gentlemen. Go back to your drawing boards."
However, before we can speculate on how to interest the science community in UFOs, we need to have UFO groups themselves come to an agreement on the importance of the information gathered and the manner in which it is presented.
The material itself, the data, although there are some excellent cases, but it is very ambiguous, and you can basically adapt it to any theory you want. Because you will select those elements of, if you're interested in the more bizarre cases, you will find plenty of those. If you're interested in the more sort of sober, you'll concentrate with radar and pilot cases. So that's what I saw, that people, because they had a theory, then they were like digging up for those elements in the database that would support their theory.
After so many years, it may be surprising to find that so few professional researchers let themselves be carried away by a scientific interest in UFOs. Perhaps we are simply seeing a contrast between the ideal vision of science and the unorthodox reality of ufology.
One of the great failings of UFO research in the Western Hemisphere anyway, and not as much in Europe, but certainly in Canada and in the United States, has been the failure to convince the scientific and academic community of the legitimacy of the subject.
I think we're setting ourselves up for a disappointment when we expect science to come up with all of the solutions. When it comes to expanding knowledge, solutions are very rare. When scientists study a matter, very rarely do they agree on what it means. Of course, when we read history books about science, we see famous names such as Galileo, Newton, and Einstein, who all made a significant contribution to scientific knowledge. But we need to remember that 99% of all scientific research does not lead anywhere. The research is done because we need to ask questions and find answers. We need to make progress. Scientists often disagree. In the field of science, it's very difficult for everyone to agree. So if we were to take a scientist out of his controlled environment and place him in a situation with amateurs and people from different backgrounds, naturally he would find it more difficult to do his job. In that type of situation, scientists tend to have the attitude that UFO researchers are not capable of producing hard evidence. They're not like scientists who produce real results. I tend to see the problem differently. If we think about it, science hasn't produced a lot over the years, considering all the conditions imposed on scientists. They need to have a diploma, publish articles, sign contracts, and so forth. In contrast, it's amazing to see how much UFO groups like SOBEPS have managed to accomplish without a controlled environment. So if anything, I would say that the opposite is actually true. It's not that UFO researchers don't take their work seriously. Given the conditions under which they work, they're very serious in their approach. Perhaps we should be demanding that scientists produce a lot more than they do.
A half-century after the birth of ufology, UFO hunters are still practically as far away from a global answer as they were back then. Can their limited success be blamed on a lack of effort, a poor choice of witnesses? Or is it simply that ufologists have had to pay the price for resorting to sensationalism once too often?
Well, obviously, we still don't know what the UFOs are. If we did, the discussion would already be on a different level. People already automatically, and this is even in France, I would say not the researchers, but the culture and the media, automatically equates UFOs with extraterrestrial beings, coming in spaceships. So this is the sort of the cultural interpretation. The popular cultural interpretation, I would say, all over the world.
In this world of superficial choices and judgments, abduction by aliens, the Roswell crash and cover-up, these are sexy. These are hot topics. Even though time is passing, Roswell's 53 years ago, it still captures the public imagination tremendously.
I think it makes it very difficult for the serious research of ufology because so much of it now has become basically a media-oriented entertainment and sensationalism.
The lack of interest in UFOs by the elite of the science community is not only due to the ufologists' tendency to believe in wild rumors of alien abductions and flying saucer crashes. It also stems from public prejudice and the superficial manner in which UFO-related matters are handled by the media. An associate member of the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, Bertrand Meust has written several books on UFOs, such as Science Fiction and Flying Saucers.
There are several factors that come into play. On one hand, there is the unstructured research that has been done up until now by amateurs, whose standards of quality are not as high as those of the science community. On the other hand, there has been this incredible challenge to have this subject regarded not only as a serious matter, but also as something important, something worthwhile studying. This message has not yet found roots within the scientific community in France. To give you an example, my peers are sociologists and ethnologists, and you wouldn't think that the study of UFOs would be a problem for them, since they study sociological and cultural phenomena. But even within these groups, UFOs are not considered to be a serious subject of study. And if a sociologist decides to study UFOs, he risks becoming a social outcast. The situation is absurd. As you can see, there is a sort of barrier, a fear of cultural or philosophical rejection.
The people that matter don't look at our findings. It is much easier to say, well, this can't be because it isn't, therefore it's not, therefore I'm not going to waste my time. It is still informed by a great deal of ignorance, and most interesting, if you go back and you study the first reports of UFOs in the major American media, going back to the summer, the autumn of 1947 or so, you will see a pattern of reportage in major American newspapers, start with the New York Times, that continues to a degree to this day, and it usually goes like this. There is an initial report of an incident, an event, a sighting. Then there is a response, either in the same article or a follow-up article, by some kind of authority, who usually would have no knowledge of the subject, but they are a psychologist, or a meteorologist, or a biologist, and they are going to tell us, well, this is nonsense, I have a PhD and I know, and the American public, the Western public, has been brilliantly conditioned, overtly and covertly, by the media, by the government, by themselves, to literally wire up in their minds when you hear UFO. You see the mouth moving, but somebody is saying, I saw a UFO. What you are hearing is, maybe I'm crazy and should be in an institution.
In order for ufology to rise above the scorn and ridicule that it faces, and in order to determine with any degree of certainty whether or not unidentified flying objects are indeed alien in origin, it is vital that this field of study receive a minimum of physical and logistic support.
In my opinion, state intervention is indispensable if you want to do a thorough job, since the most useful sources of information are generally state agencies. If we take France, for instance, there is the state police, the Air Force, and civil aviation. Obviously, these organizations are not going to pass on information, especially the Air Force, with its need to keep defense issues confidential. It's very difficult for someone outside of these agencies to obtain information such as radar data.
In the late 1970s, France became the only member of the GA to set up such an agency. It was called CEPRA. As part of its mandate, this group examines unidentified phenomena in French aerospace. Located within CNES, France's National Space Research Center, the equivalent of NASA, CEPRA has been headed by engineer Jean-Jacques Velasco for quite a few years.
CNES is a public sector agency that distributes information. We don't have anything to hide. These days, we let the public know about a lot of our investigations, and we will continue to do so in the future. However, keeping the public informed of our investigations is not part of CEPRA's mandate, as was the case for its predecessor, Japan, which prepared technical notes and informational notes. The difference between the two groups is quite simple. We just don't have the means.
Although he admits that his group does not have the logistic support necessary to carry out a global study of the UFO phenomenon, Jean-Jacques Velasco does not see how CEPRA could associate itself with UFO groups without putting its own credibility and that of CNES on the line.
What is commonly referred to as ufology is a large group of people primarily interested in UFO sightings. They have developed an interest in the subject as amateurs. We are not at all in the same class as those groups of amateurs. Here we do scientific work. We investigate sightings and check out the facts that are reported. Our work consists of scientifically analyzing the facts, and that's all.
Other than France, only a few countries in South America have set up official agencies to collect UFO reports, often undercover as part of their military activities. Elsewhere in the world, UFO reports are lost, destroyed, or find their way into a box in the basement of an administrative building. In Canada, the RCMP and Transport Canada used to send their reports to the National Research Centre in Ottawa. After a quick read-through, the reports were then transferred to the National Archives building, where they waited patiently for someone to come along and examine them. Recently, Canadian UFO researcher Chris Rutkowski decided to do something constructive with these reports of UFO sightings.
After the year 2000, an arrangement between myself and Transport Canada allows the reporting of objects seen in the sky to be made through them to me, and I produce an annual report of sighting activity to try and understand what it is that people were seeing. You see, the National Research Council itself was not interested in UFOs, but the possibility that UFO reports might lead to the recovery of meteorites. But I've chosen to do something with the data because I think it's important that we understand what it is that people are seeing. Not what is perhaps reported in the tabloid newspapers, perhaps not what we see in the movies, but what is it that is actually seen by people? And to do that, we need the actual reports. So it is a very good arrangement from a scientific standpoint, simply collecting the data from Quebec, from Newfoundland, from British Columbia, from the Yukon and Nunavut now as well, and analyzing the data for an understanding of what it is people really are experiencing and seeing when they report a UFO.
Chris Rutkowski's initiative is an exception to the rule. In the United States, where more UFO sightings are reported than anywhere else in the world, there is no mechanism in place to provide UFO groups with a copy of these reports. They usually end up in a shredder.
One of the things to me that puzzles me that after all these years in the United States, for instance, no single repository was created for all the files. That would have been money much better spent, you know, and just create a central location where when the organizations go out of business, or which happens, you know, when the leader dies or something like that, there's nothing.
After 50 years of UFO research, how can we best sum up the results? Researchers, for the most part amateurs, have still not succeeded in rallying the science community to their cause. Living on the edge, they are constantly faced with prejudice. For the time being, UFO hunters continue their pursuit, navigating through strange worlds in the search for evidence to support their theories. Beyond the rhetoric of UFO groups, it is clear that if scientific institutions were to undertake a serious study of UFOs, they would not make long philosophical speeches on the wonders of science. They would proceed methodically, impervious to the war of words being waged by UFO groups.
The Americans need more of the sociological theory and the Europeans need less. Because in America, it's not at all liked by the ufological community, who is completely committed to strictly nuts and bolts, ET, aliens, crash saucers, genetical hybrids with abductions and so on. But in Europe, with some of these groups, you go to the other extreme where everything gets reduced to it's just a myth. But a myth still takes off from something, you know.
Myths from North America, specifically from the United States, have swept through Europe. Researchers like Scorno, myself and others have Well, I wouldn't exactly say that we've given up, but we're still interested, but no one listens to us anymore. Well, they still listen to Pierre Lagrange, who seems to be able to find ways to make himself heard. But no one really listens to us anymore. They're only interested in those myths from the United States. There's another factor that's also becoming into play: the Internet. As a professor, I have several students who are interested in UFOs, but they know nothing of all the serious research that was done on the subject. When they hear the expression flying saucer, they immediately think of the American myths and all of the information circulating on the Internet. To summarize, when I was 25 years old, UFOs were things flying around in the sky. We would go into the field to observe them. These days, young people look up information on the Internet. That's why I'm a lot less interested now. It's become a sort of virtual reality.